Hi, can I have everyone's attention, please? My name is Andrew Medina. I'm with the Asian and Pacific Islander Legislative Caucus. We're one of the co-hosts for today's briefing. We're also co-hosting with the Latino Legislative Caucus. So we have Armando and Willie here, who are consultants for the Latino Legislative Caucus. So thank you for all for coming. And this is such a great reception of people to come and learn about Asian American and Latino voters in California. The presentation is by the California Civic Engagement Project. We have the founder and director, Professor Mindy Romero, who's going to be here presenting her research on the last election cycle regarding Asian American and Latino voters. She's a political psychologist with a Ph.D. from UC Davis, which is my alma mater, so go Aggies. She has a focus on political behavior and race and intersections of those two, which is really great. So I'm really happy to be able to welcome Professor Romero to present her research to us.
Thank you very much. I see a lot of friendly faces out here. So I'm mic'd, but I'm mic'd for the video. I'm not mic'd for the room. So can everyone hear me okay? Okay. If I start to trail off, just do this to me, all right? Okay. It's a small room, but you never know. So my name is Mindy Romero, and I direct the California Civic Engagement Project. And we're housed at the UC Davis Center for Regional Change. We're part of UC Davis in the center. And for those of you that don't know us, I also see a lot of new faces here. We are both a research and outreach initiative for the state of California. So we were established, we were founded to inform good governance, dialogue around good governance in California. And our mission really is to inform efforts, all kinds of efforts, right? Variety of stakeholders. Aimed at increasing participation in California, civic and electoral participation. Why do we do that? Because we see civic engagement, and particularly electoral participation, as intimately interconnected with a whole host of social outcomes, and ultimately the well-being of the state. So pretty much you name it, unemployment rates, high school dropout rates, health disparities. Where you find those, you find areas that also have low involvement civically and electorally. So it's both an explanation, but also civic engagement can be a key catalyst for change, right? So that's what we do in a nutshell, and I invite you to please go onto our website. We also are a resource, so all of our publications, all of our data, everything that you find in our publications, the maps, the charts, those sorts of things, are all available publicly on our website. Everything we do, we want to make accessible. If you can't find something, just call us and let us know, but we want it to be of use to folks in whatever ways make sense for them beyond just how we've framed it or published it, okay? All right. So as you all know, I'm here to talk about the Latino and Asian American vote here in California. So the research that I'm going to cover today comes directly from a recent publication titled California's Latino and Asian American Vote, Dramatic Underrepresentation in 2014 and an Expected Impact in 2016. So there are copies, I think here or maybe outside now, if you haven't picked one up, and you can also get it off our website, of course. What I'd like you to know at the outset is that I'm going to go through the data pretty quickly. So surely there'll be things that you wanted to, maps or charts that you want to look at again or discover more things, or you might have a question. Know that you can go right to the policy brief and find it. So every data point, there's some exceptions of some new data that I'm showing you, and I'll tell you when those are, when we get to those points. But aside from those, if I mention it up here, I mention it in the same way in the policy brief. So you should be able to find it and be able to pull that yourself and look at it later. Okay? So there are three main research questions from that policy brief and three main questions I'm going to tackle in the talk today. Come on in. How did the Latino and Asian American vote differ from the rest of the electorate in 2014? What can we expect in 2016, right? The $64,000 question everybody wants to know. And then what can be done to improve Latino and Asian American turnout? This is the solutions, right? So you know I'm gonna, if you just heard the interview I gave a moment ago, you know I'm gonna give you some concerning numbers, but we don't wanna leave there. We wanna talk about how can we change those numbers, right? And so we'll talk about some of the common explanations in the literature, and certainly this will go through somewhat quickly in the hopes that in the Q&A we'll talk about it more. And other folks will share as well. And really quickly on methodology, our data is actual voter records from the statewide database, and then you hear me talk about population data by and large, that's from the California Department of Finance. Okay, so that first question. So now you all have, I'm going to pose a question back to you, but I realize that many of you have the brief, of course, right now in your hands, and you can look it up. So don't look it up. And if you've already heard this data point, try to hold back. But I'd like you all to think for a moment. Try to answer this question. Let me define eligible. So what is the eligible Latino turnout rate in 2014, last November? Eligible here is the percentage of those that were eligible, citizen eligible, over 18, right? Latinos. What percentage of that population actually turned out to vote? So anyone? Don't. Huh? 10%? Okay, anyone else? 30%? Anyone? Maybe many of you have read the brief already too. Okay. So there's some people who haven't read it, yeah. So 17.3%. So again, 17.3% of those that were citizen eligible Latinos actually turned out to vote. So let me put some magnitude around that. Yeah?
Did you say eligible, does that also mean registered to vote?
No, that'd be registered voter turnout, in this case eligible, yeah. And I can talk in the Q&A why we look at one versus the other. In the brief, we do give numbers on registered voter turnout too. So nearly 7 million eligible Latinos in California, a little over 1 million actually turned out to vote. What about the Asian American voter turnout? I'll give you this number, 18.4%, so also very, very low. Magnitude here, 3 million, but only about 550,000 actually turned out to vote that were eligible. So, and just to give you some sense, so we know that, actually let me go back here for a moment. We know in 2014 in November, probably many of you know by now, that it was a record low turnout, right? Only 31% of all all eligible folks in California actually turned out to vote. But there's a great degree of difference across age, across race, across ethnicity. And one of the things that we wanted to look at is we kept hearing that number, right, from folks. And we said, well, what about typically underrepresented groups that turn out to vote even less? We know in midterm elections, turnout is lower for everybody. Typically, it's lower for Latinos and Asian Americans. But what about in a record low year? So in really low turnout years, it's usually even lower. And you can see it was quite low. Just to give a bit of context here, so in 2012 and 2010, turnout certainly better in 2012 because that's a presidential election. We expect it to be higher. 2010 was actually, comparatively speaking, in recent memory, a better year for turnout. But the story of disparity, even though the numbers changed, the disparity is there, right, across groups. And then just really briefly, this is in the policy briefs, but just to emphasize, if we look at regions, and you can't see it back there, but Central Region, Los Angeles region, North State region, Sacramento region, and so forth, there's a great deal of difference across regions, and also in some areas the disparity is a little bit less, some areas it's a little bit more, right, the difference across groups. Now let me give you probably a better visual by county across California. So this first map is total eligible voter turnout in California by county. The shading is quite simple. It's the lightest shade is 0 to 20, then it goes 20 to 30, 30 to 40, 40 to 50, and that deep dark rust shade is 50 to 65 because that was our cap. So even though, and you'll see 30.8, the Secretary of State's number is 30.9 for that record low turnout, ours is 30.8, slightly different methodology. So 30.8%. But if you look across the state, right, particularly the Central Valley and Southern California, many counties that were under 20% in their eligible voter turnout. Okay? So keep that in mind as we talk about that low year. And this is for everyone. Now let's look at Asian American turnout. There's more variation here. And you'll see there's some counties that are in that dark shade of rust. Now when you're talking about some of these really small counties, the populations for Asian Americans also are very low, so small shifts in numbers can make big shifts in percentages. So there's stories here that we could talk about, but just to show the variation for today. And then look at Latino. So what story is here? This is actually quite a large degree of consistency, right? So almost every county, the majority of counties are in that under 20%. Remember, it's 17.4% for the state as a whole, right? And we have a few that go above that, and some that go below 15%, right? Quite low. Okay, so we've looked at the state level, we've looked at the region really briefly, the county level, and something new I wanted to show all of you was, what if we take out apart a county and we look by community? So often when we hear within a county, right, we try to figure out the differences in turnout, we're looking at city council level or supervisory level or assembly district within a county or something like that. But for most folks that are on the ground trying to do work in communities, maybe trying to increase or mobilize their communities or register their communities, districts don't necessarily make sense. People know their communities and they work by community level, right? So in Sacramento, there's about 100 or so commonly recognized communities: Del Paso Heights, Meadowview, Oak Park, Fruit Ridge, Land Park, and so on. And so we broke out the numbers looking at commonly known communities. So you live in this community, this is what your turnout rate is, okay? And we've tweeted these out just recently too, but I assume for most of you this is new. This is not in the brief. So this is total registered turnout, voter turnout for Sacramento, and here we're using registered voter turnout because we're not able to do eligible voter turnout, at least to the degree of comfort that we'd like to in terms of statistics. So we are using a registered voter turnout. The county average is 48%, a little bit above the state average. But if you break out the county, let's focus on the far right. That's the county as a whole, and it's divided by communities, right? So it's hard to see, but if you can trust me, we've got the Delta, we've got Cortland, we've got Franklin Place, we've got Galt, we've got Wilton, we've got Mather, we've got Valley High, Delta Shores, Laguna Creek, and so forth, right? First thing you may notice, and you could look at these and probably see so many more things that I'm seeing right now, but one thing you could see is that you've got a core that has a lot of light, and we've zoomed in. This is the core of Sacramento County. I'll talk about it in just a second. But you've got most of the dark, most of the higher performing turnout areas are on the periphery, right? In the suburbs, if you will. Not all of it suburbs, but on the periphery of the county. And again, these shades here are 0 to 30 is the lightest shade, registered turnout, so the scale moves up a little bit. 0 to 40, 40 to 50, 50 to 60, and that darkest shade is 60 to almost 70, okay, for this map. If we zoom in on the core of Sacramento, we see a lot more light, right? And we see communities like Land Park, that's in that 60 to 70% range, right next to South Sacramento, or Curtis Park right next to Oak Park, right? Quite a degree of difference, just a mile apart from each other. And there are reasons for this in a moment. I'll show you income overlay on this as well. But Asian registered voter turnout, you go back, what we see is, of course, more light, right, because turnout is lower. And then Latinos also more light, and again, a little bit more consistent in terms of, you don't have the highs and lows pulling for an average, you have more of a lower average. Now let me show you again just briefly for turnout. So we're still working on this map a little bit. I know it's a little hard to read, there's a lot of data here, but if you bear with me, it's the same community names, same scale. This is total registered turnout. It's this map, but what we've done is we've laid on top of that the cross hatch, if you will, is to indicate communities that are low income. So the median income is 40% or less, 40,000 or less, excuse me. So again, what do you see here? Not to get to the core. In the core, you see, right, lower income, more lower income communities, and you see lower income communities being the ones here typically that are also the lower turnout. Or if you ask yourself, where are the low turnout communities? They are in low income communities. Okay? So moving on to reg rates, going back up to the state level. So we have a two-step voter registration process voting process in the US. You must first register to vote before you can vote, right? Pretty simple. But we do have disparities in registration rates. So at the get-go, when people want to go vote, they have to be registered before they can do that, and not everybody's at that same marker. So any given election, typically, our general registration rates, and a registration rate is what percent of those that are eligible to vote actually registered, whether they voted or not, okay? Usually about 3/4 of the total population is registered. Many in this last election didn't vote, but are registered. Latinos, in 2014, in November, 63%, and Asian Americans typically are lower in terms of their eligible turnout, in their registration rates. Another reason why, if you wanted to look at registered voter turnout, we prefer to look at eligible voter turnout. One reason, though, is you'll see some groups that have very low, like youth as well, have very low registration rates, but maybe they could have higher registered voter turnout, but you'd have a high registered turnout of a low population. Okay. And here, in terms of registration, looking over the last decade, it's been Latinos and Asian Americans that have been driving the registration in California, the registration rate. So if you look at just absolute numbers, they've been growing at a much faster pace than the general electorate, and non-Latino whites actually decreasing a bit in terms of absolute numbers. Okay, so registration rates, again, just to visualize. So these in 2014 are the numbers I just gave you, that 62, that 50, that 73. If you took out and you looked at everybody that was not Latino or not Asian American, you would find that the registration rate is about 80, almost 84%, much higher. And again, different rates. Typically, registration rates are a little bit higher in a presidential year. But what we see here is actually some fluctuation, which is important and can make a difference in an election. But still, in terms of the story of disparity, we see a pretty consistent story in many ways, right? Okay. So declining share of the Latino vote. So despite the increases in registration for Latinos, and I'll talk about Asian Americans in just a moment too, and they've also had big increases in the population over the last decade, right? Our report goes back a decade and then goes forward as well. Their percentage of the vote, so this is now our pie that we're talking about now when we say percentage of the vote, is all voters, right? All folks that actually voted in California in 2014 in that November election. Latinos were 15.4%, Asian Americans 7.4%. Let me visualize this for you and change over time. So this is now just looking at Latinos. So the red is the Latino percent of registered voters, whether they voted or not. Can you see okay over here? Okay, and I'm moving back and forth, so you may have to be doing. And the blue line is the percent, the Latino percent of the vote, of actual voters casting a ballot in some form. So you see that steady increase, right? And Latinos have been increasing their share of all registered voters. But for share of the vote, we see a zigzag, and we would expect that zigzag because in presidential years, turnout is higher, and it's higher for Latinos. And and the gap narrows a bit between Latinos and the rest of the electorate. So their share of the vote, it's not just that it's higher, it's actually the gap narrows a bit. So their share of the vote's better, higher. And if you look at midterm to midterm to midterm and presidential to presidential, you see a steady increase. Does that make sense? Midterm to midterm, presidential to presidential. Until we get to 2014 and we see a decline, and that decline is the largest decline since 2006, right? And what essentially is happening here is throughout the decade, despite low turnout, the proportions of the eligible population, right, that Latinos have made up has been increasing. So not the only factor, but a major factor in their increase in the share of the vote has been their increase in the population, right, a bigger part of the pie overall. Until you get to 2014 where turnout was so much lower. Remember, the disparities usually grow. So the disparity was that much lower in 2014 that it couldn't counteract, if you will, the increase in population, because every year we've had increases in population for Latinos. Now for Asian Americans, we see that red line, pretty steady increase again, smaller proportions, but a pretty steady increase. And we still saw an increase in 2014, although a decent increase in 2014 and almost the same as 2012 there. Okay, so what does all this mean? So Latinos and Asian Americans are underrepresented. We know they turn out less, but when we talk about representation, what I'm talking about today is numeric representation. So if you were represented in the electorate, if you were 15.4% of the vote, you'd be 15.4% of the eligible population. 25%, you'd be 25%, right? Above or below your proportion of eligible voters means you're over or underrepresented. Now you may want your group or a group to have higher turnout and to be overrepresented, but if you were about on par, we'd say that you were numerically represented. So in 2014, there's that 15.4% for Latinos, right, compared to 28%, compared to, of course, 39% of the population. And Asian Americans, 7.4 to 12.4. So it's a story of underrepresentation. So what should one expect? Let's move on to 2016. Anybody want to take a crack at what they think the Latino and Asian American proportions of California's overall population will be in 2040? There's a lot of speculation in the news, right? A lot of, demographics are changing, but what is that really? Huh? Let's take Latino. What do you think the Latino proportion of the population is going to be in 2040? Did I hear a number? 55? 65? 40? My reaction does not indicate whether you're hot or cold. Although that would be a fun little game to play. Okay, so I'll show you in a moment, but first a little context. So from about now, 2015 to 2040, both populations are projected to grow. And here we're working with the California Department of Finance. They put out population projections every few years on a whole host of groups, including Latinos and Asian Americans, 41, 33% respectively, right? This is of their overall in absolute numbers. African American population will increase 5.4%, and non-Latino whites will actually decrease their proportion, or decrease in their population. Latinos, though, will drive about 3/4 of the state's overall population growth. So both Latinos and Asian Americans are growing pretty impressive numbers, but because of their sheer size, Latinos are driving the story of population change. Okay, got that? Just through the sheer size, okay. So here's a quick map to show you that, to visualize. So this is, again, projected total population, but we start back at 2012, which is an actual. And each color, so if you can't see, the blue line is white non-Hispanic. I put white non-Latino here. Latino is red, Asian American is green, black, purple, and so on. In 2014, there's that crossover. So where we heard that Latinos became the most populous, right, group in California, first to plurality, and now, right, they are now almost 40% of the population. So there's a crossover, and you can see after 2014, for Latinos and white non-Hispanics, they go on their merry way in opposite directions. For Asian Americans, an increase certainly, but it's a smaller increase, again, because of the very large increases by Latinos. So remember this, okay? And we see here's the answer to your question, who said 40? I know, is it like The Price is Right, where if you go over, you lose? Or the closest one? I'm not sure. 45%. Latino proportion of the total population in 2040. And why do we stop at 2040? That's when our data allows us to, so far our data allows us to go and feel comfortable in those projections. So, and this is from again, publicly available data, but this matches up with other data that we have to 2040. So, and then 30.4 for white non-Hispanics, right? Okay, so increases in the total population will mean increases in the eligible voter population. And that different, so I showed you in 2014, 39% of the population for Latinos, for instance, right? Or versus 28% of the eligible voter population. That gap, because there's a gap, 28 to 39, will be narrowing for both groups. There are gaps between eligible and the total population. So by 2040, the Latino eligible population in absolute numbers will increase 77%, Asian American 37%, and we see some increase still here, and non-Latino whites, again, this is eligible voter population, or CVAP, citizen voting age population, will increase still a little bit. Now let's look at that on a map and visualize that. So the same kind of chart, the same color system, right? Red is Latino, blue, white non-Hispanic. And remember in 2014 when we were looking at the percent of the total population, they crossed here and went on their merry way to 45 and 30? They're not crossing here, are they? Here you see the 28% that I mentioned a moment ago, right? And then for Asian Americans as well. They don't cross until 2040, right? So Latino percentage of the eligible voter population and the white percentage of the eligible voter population. And then pretty steady for Asian Americans. Okay, so that to say though, there's still big changes, right? We're still seeing growth, but it's important that if we hear a narrative that Latinos are going to be a certain proportion of the population, if we really want to make change, if we really want to increase turnout for everyone, including Latinos, we need to understand the challenges, right? And the increases in the eligible voter population will be coming and are coming, but in terms of where we're at now, the proportion is not as large as maybe some people might assume so. And although in a moment I'll show you this great variation across the state. So in California now, for about 2015, for the first time, we have a majority-minority electorate. So white non-Hispanics are below 50% of the eligible voter population. So the first major election, 2016. We said we wanted to project out the vote. Once you have projections around the eligible voter population, you can actually start to make projections on a group's percent of the vote going forward, if that makes sense. Can't do it for population, you have to have eligible voter population. And we worked with the California Department of Finance to acquire and get the projections on eligible voter population. This is all available if you're interested in it. So once you have that, you can begin to project out. And we did this a number of ways, but a simple way that we show in the brief is, what if we said turnout rates just stayed the same? They stayed constant from 2012. If we're interested in projecting out for presidential years, the most recent is 2012. It wasn't a high water mark for the decade, right? It's not going to stay exactly the same. But to be able to isolate the impact of population change and be able to have some real numbers for discussion, we said, okay, that was 39.4% because it was a presidential year, so it was higher. Eligible turnout rate. If it stayed constant going forward through 2040, what would happen? So just by 2016, the Latino share of the vote would move up to 21%. It was about 19% in 2012, again, driven by population change. Now, if you increase turnout rates, you're increasing, right, that share of the vote that much further. If you decrease, right, so there's lots of room for change in there, and projections are only as good as their assumptions that they're based on, and I'm happy to talk about that too. By 2040, again, maintaining that same eligible turnout rate, the Latino share of the vote would be 29% of the population. But again, increased turnout rates, you're increasing the share of the vote that much more. For Asian Americans, by 2040, they would increase slightly to about 8%. And here, together, Latinos and Asian Americans will combine to 37% of eligible voters who actually cast a vote. So they're percent together of the vote. And in the state as a whole, to combine, they will be 50%, just over 50% of all eligible voters. And in many counties, far beyond 50%, okay? And combined, in some counties, very close to 50% of voters as we project. So hotspots. So that growth that I just gave you, all these numbers I just gave you, are going to vary tremendously, though, across regions and counties. Some areas are going to grow even faster. Some areas are going to grow not very much. So if you are interested in understanding and identifying the strengths of both of these groups in terms of the electorate, in terms of the impact, you really need to be able to understand the magnitude and the timeline of these population changes, right? Along with whatever other types of methods you're taking to engage these groups. So one of the things we did, this is also not available in the brief, but these will be available on our website starting tomorrow. We created, well, before I show you this, so there's the brief that you have in hand that's on our website. Many of you have had it previously. We've also created, though, some fact sheets, one for the state of California, which is just a synopsis of the brief, but we also created some fact sheets in 4 main regions in California: LA, San Joaquin, Sacramento, and Silicon Valley. And those fact sheets highlight the same kind of analysis, but data specific to those regions. And so if you're interested in those areas, you can look up and see what was our 2014 turnout, where are we going in 2016 and beyond, right? So just to give you a taste of that, looking at the projected citizen voting age, so this is the same chart here. This is for the state of California. This is for the San Joaquin Valley. Here, they don't cross until 2040. Here, Latinos and white non-Hispanics cross sooner, right? And a smaller proportion in the San Joaquin Valley for Asian Americans. Here's the LA region. And again, you can study these on our website. I'm just showing you to give you a taste. You can go search them. Sacramento region, there isn't a crossover there in 2040. And Silicon Valley. And here, of course, the Asian American population is much higher, right? It's the most second in terms of proportions. And this really is the strength. The Silicon San Francisco Bay Area is where the strength of the growth for the Asian American vote will be quite significant over the next 25 years. And if you're curious for the Latino population, of course, LA, in terms of sheer numbers, 2.7 million or so new eligible Latinos. But in terms of proportions, in terms of percentages, it's going to be, not proportions, in terms of percentage growth over absolute numbers, it's going to be the San Joaquin Valley, and I could talk more about that. Okay, so what can be done to improve the Latino and Asian turnout? So I'll just briefly go through this because hopefully in the Q&A we'll talk about it some more. First off, there are many factors in place that will predict low turnout, that we would expect low turnout to continue. So why was it so low in 2014? Well, first off, it was a midterm. We're not going to break a statewide, I'm going out on a limb, Gosh, and I hope I'm right. We're not going to break the statewide general turnout, right? We're going to break that record like we did in November, because the next election is a presidential election, right? So we could break a presidential general election, and hopefully that doesn't happen, but we won't see below 31% in November 2016. But there were other things. So probably many have heard by now that the context of 2014, many people said that they didn't even know there was a governor's race. We didn't have a Senate race. We didn't have a lot of highly controversial ballot initiatives, although many people would beg to differ on that. That's important because competitive races, money in a race, for all its good and bad, competition, period, but media, discussion, right, tells people there's an election and it pulls people in. You don't have all of that, then many people don't know there's one or don't feel compelled to vote. Lack of outreach. So we know Latinos and Asian Americans get far less outreach from campaigns and candidates than other groups. When it's a low activity election, they get even less. There wasn't a whole lot going on in 2014 and they got even less. And I'll talk about that in a moment some more. Declining party affiliation. So the state of California is becoming more and more no party preference. That's very much happening for Asian Americans, and I invite you to look at those details in the brief, but also for Latinos. They're not solidly Democratic. They have been. They are a majority, but they are declining as well off of their Democratic rules. And those that register no party preference have significantly lower turnout rates than those that are registered with parties. There's a little bit of a self-selection process going on there, but I could talk about in the Q&A, but still the facts are they are disconnected from a party. They're not getting that outreach, that mobilization. And demographics. As California, right, becomes more and more, the proportions of groups that don't turn out to vote as high, as they become a larger share of the pie, right, then that's going to be a challenge to our overall turnout rates. It's the reason why everyone should care. Everyone should care in terms of strength of our democracy. And yes, voter apathy was there, but I argue that most of the time when you hear voter apathy, particularly in the media or whoever is kind of trying to sum up what happened in an election, ask yourselves, is it really apathy? Most voters care. There's a reason why that they didn't vote, beyond not caring. They're feeling disconnected. They're feeling the political process doesn't speak for them, right? That sort of thing. And what happened is those that were already likely to vote were the ones that voted. So really quickly, in terms of approaches, what can be done? So electoral system, so reforms around access, so making voting more easier and more accessible. So we know that registration requirements disproportionately impact Latinos and Asian Americans, deadlines, access to limited language ballots and so forth for those that are limited English proficient. Outreach, I just talked about the lack of outreach in 2014, but we have an electoral system where campaigns and candidates are really responsible. They do the primary mobilization, right? And in some ways, the education with voters. And those that don't, because we use a likely voter model, by and large, those that are involved in campaigns don't reach out in their limited resources to folks that aren't seemingly likely to vote. Research shows us, though, that if they are Latinos and Asians, particularly Asian Americans, are outreached to and given that deep connection, they do vote. Civics education, a key part. What I'll say here is we have an abysmal civics education in California, but those places that we do have some cool things going on, and we do have some teachers and principals that are doing some awesome things, often those are in communities that are not going to be Latino and Asian American communities or low-income communities, or less likely to get some of that innovation. And so they have usually even poorer civic experience. We can activate here, then we get a wider demographic kind of cut, right? Kids that vote if they're connected to before they turn 18, they're much more likely to vote when they turn 18 and to become lifelong voters. We can bring up our numbers if we are able to connect with our high school seniors, period, across demographic groups. And then new approaches. I'll leave that to any of you that want to discuss that. But the bottom line here is that when we talk about solutions, we need to be asking ourselves, whether it's at the legislative level or at a community level, gosh, these are the numbers. So what we're hoping to do, is it going to increase turnout? Okay, great. Is it going to increase turnout of the folks that are least likely to vote? Or are we going to is it not going to work? Or if it's going to work, are we going to end up inadvertently creating more gaps, right, or greater disparities? So we have to be addressing and asking those questions around reforms. Does this get to folks that have unique challenges, right? They're particularly disaffected, disproportionately impacted by barriers. And then lastly, there's too much on here, but we need to understand, if we're looking at increasing participation, we have to understand the characteristics of non-voters, right? And demographics are a big part of that, and understanding demographic change is a big part of that. Targeting our young folks, of course, folks of color, and then here it comes, the democracy punch. But it's true, achieving a fully participating electorate is critical to realizing a robust democracy in our state, right? A fully participating. And right now, our numbers show us, our numbers tell us, they're screaming to us that we do not have a fully participatory democracy. We have disparities. We are not serving all of the groups in our state well when it comes to making sure they have a voice in our democratic system. The numbers don't lie. So, and that's it. And we're still, I was surprised, I just checked time. We're doing okay. I was rushing through because I wanted to make sure we had decent Q&A because so many of you came. So I'm happy to cover anything that I kind of whizzed through. Yeah?
I wanted to, I was pretty proud of us electing Eric Guerra, and I think he won by 77% of his vote, and mostly Latinos, and we were all out there counting doors day by day. So I believe in miracle, I believe we would repeat this each time.
Yeah.
You know, we have two bozos in the city council that have sex discrimination abuse against their women. No respect for women. And as a Chicana, I want those two bozos out. We can put our own people in. That's all.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? Oh, yeah.
You touched on the youth a little bit, but I'm curious about with the growth of the different demographics, there's a growth in the youth vote too, is there not?
Oh, you mean in terms of the size of their population?
The Latinos, the Asians are a younger population.
Yeah.
Over time compared to current.
Yeah, great question. Actually, if we're just looking at the youth population, and here I'll define it as 18 to 24, even though you are correct that, and it stands to reason, right? I was just saying this at another presentation the other day. If we're growing in proportions Latino and Asian American and they're younger, wouldn't we be growing proportions of younger people, period, in California? We're not. So for the next 18 years or so, we are declining in our proportions of the population that is age 18 to 24. Now, of those that are here in California, right, they're increasingly, right, of color, but and then between now and 2020, we're actually the proportion that is 18 to 24, not just absolute numbers, but make sure I've got it right. The absolute numbers between now and 2020 are actually declining. So, and we have these data available on our website too. But it's quite striking. You look at the 18 to 24-year-old group, and it's actually going down in absolute numbers and in proportions. And then after 2020, for a bit longer, they continue to decline in proportions. Yeah. So when we've done a lot of work on the youth vote, and when I talk to people about the challenges around the youth vote, one challenge is their decline. So we're becoming an older society, right? Not just U.S. as a whole, but yes, in California. We're slightly behind the rest of the nation. It's taking us a little bit longer, but we are aging. And if you were concerned about the strength of the youth voice, period, so even if you got to, of course, youth are terribly underrepresented too, right? Their turnout rate was 8% in November, 18 to 24, regardless of race or ethnicity. But if you're concerned about them, and even if you got to where numerically there was representation, right, you're having a declining voice or size of the electorate. And so to overcome that, if you want youth to have a larger voice in policy decisions, for instance, you actually have to increase turnout that much more. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm not sure if this is something that you've looked at, but have you considered the impact of the top two primary on turnout?
A lot of folks have looked at that. We haven't done any research ourselves on that. See Paul's itching over there. So I think, I know one colleague here he's not here today, but Eric McGee over at PPIC, they've done work on that. A number of scholars have looked at that. And I think there's been, it's a really small N. We haven't had a lot of elections, obviously, to really look at that, but there's been some positive indication, but not, if you're looking at whether it's been changing elections, not a lot of indication in terms of changing elections. Yeah. Oh, I think, go ahead.
I'm curious, and I'm not sure if you already mentioned this, but did you possibly look at the differences between different subgroups within the Asian American community, for example, since it's such a diverse group, socioeconomically and
Yeah, thank you.
I'm just curious, like a South Asian population versus like
Yeah, and I was going to mention that too. Thank you so much. So because of limitations in our data, we are looking at Asian Americans, and of course there's a great degree of disparity. So that's a one pan-ethnic identity that has many, many subgroups within it. And there's a great deal of variation across those subgroups in terms of their participation. That's really important. There's a lot of great scholars that do very specific work. Karthik Ramakrishnan down at LA does work on the Asian American vote, has produced a number of reports that are just fantastic if you're interested in that detailed by subgroup. But the story is still the same in terms of disparity from, if you look at even the variation of turnout within the Asian American community, it's still lower by and large versus whites, right? Or the more dominant groups in terms of their share of the turnout. So it's still a discussion of disparity, but there's certainly opportunity, and if you are in some communities and you're really mobilized and really outreach to, we have seen incidents where turnout can be much higher than trends would have predicted, right? The Doe race in Orange County recently, that was a race that surprised a lot of people. And yeah, I think you had your hand up.
You're talking about three different buckets, obviously. You're talking about the overall population of California, and then you're talking about the eligible voter or CVAT population, and then finally about turnout. And I think everybody should be shocked that you have this point in time right now where you're seeing non-white or non-Latino whites and Latinos kind of meeting, an intersection where Latinos are becoming a larger part of the state's population. But that won't be reflected in our eligible voters for another 25 years. So there's like 25-year lag between now and then for that intersection to happen between overall population and eligible voters.
Yeah, so the chart that I showed where they convene.
Do you have any projections of what it would be to the next step, which is turnout? When will turnout have that same intersection of Latinos becoming larger than non-Latino whites in an election? Because even in your data at the back, it says something like, it looks like 68% of the electorate in the 38 or 40 election would still be non-Latino whites.
Yeah, so if you're looking at, so the three main things that we're talking about are proportion of the population, at least the second half of the talk, proportion of the total population, proportion of the eligible voter population, and you're right, so remember 2040 is when those intersect, that's what you're talking about, right?
So when's the intersection for
And then, but turnout wasn't what, I'm talking about percent of the vote, and sometimes I'll show a chart too that'll show the same color coding, the same style, and you'll see the percent of the vote. So the intersection in percent of the vote extends beyond what we've done in terms of looking through 2040. I'll say this. So like I said, we looked at it a number of ways. The easiest way for most folks to kind of get their head around when we're projecting out the percent of the vote is to say if turnout stayed constant, right? Just kind of stayed about the same, right? Given the changes in population, we see the projections like the 21% I said in 2016. So when you start getting that far out and when groups start to become, here's the biggest question mark if you really want to know my thoughts on this. As both Latinos and Asian Americans become a larger percentage of the population, I speculate, and I'm doing some of my own research around this, that as they become a larger share of eligible voters and a larger share of voters, that in a sense you could have kind of an exponential growth, that impact, knowing that we have more impact, right? Knowing that, well, gosh, we were 10% and now we're 20 and now we're 40, or in our community over here, we're 40 or 50, right? You reach kind of a tipping point. So there's a tipping point in terms of impact on individual candidates or races, right? And that can happen anywhere along that timeline, right, before 2040, as I mentioned in the brief at the, I think the back page, there's potential for a tipping point in impacting races. But taking out individual races, just will there be an impact just by the sheer kind of growth in the communities where we begin to see that we've got numbers that are so large, right? Communities say to themselves that knowing that we have a greater impact and a greater say will also therefore then encourage and increase our turnout that much more. Unknown factors would be, well, maybe now this community is 50% Latino or really high percent of the vote. So now we're going to turn more resources to that community, right? Campaigns and candidates are going to look at them and say, hey, right? So then that's an external factor, and that could very well happen. We say it a lot, right? The candidates and campaigns should be taking the Latino vote and the Asian American vote very seriously now and going forward. But beyond that external influence, is there something that will happen just to these communities when they start to realize that their share of the vote or their vote in a given race that just happened really made a difference? Does that increase their likelihood of turning out more? And I suspect that that will start to happen. But where to predict that, that's a fool's game at this point. But we are starting to put some thoughts around what that might look like. So that's a good question. Yeah. Yeah.
Do you pick out immigrants that become Americans?
Not for this study, no. But for Latinos and Asian Americans, generally speaking, at least in the last decade of research, it's been pretty understood that if you're naturalized, you are more likely to turn out to vote. Yeah. Yeah. Hello.
Hello. Great presentation. I have like a list of 5 questions. I'll just ask one.
Okay. I'll be here afterwards too.
When you were doing your research, did any particular community pop up consistently as one that was doing it right or was head and shoulders on other communities? And if you did find such a result, do you have any theory as to why they're standing out?
Okay, so the study, the policy brief itself is looking at the state level. And then we have had for quite a while actually data available at the regional and the county level. We have not looked at the community level until we did this pilot look at Sacramento. And even then, to be honest with you, it's a quantitative analysis looking at the numbers, informing folks that do work in Sacramento, right, in communities. So to be able to say what's driving it, I mean, there's lots of great efforts at the community level, and we know that it makes an impact. Heavily contested races, a lot of interest in a race, a lot of money, a lot of outreach, all can make impacts. It just depends on what I don't know if I'm answering your question, but yeah.
I'm actually very interested in that same thing because I ran a race that for a friend of mine who is Latino, certainly he's Latino, and that district, it was red where he campaigned and it was yellow where he didn't. It was just pretty interesting to see.
Yeah. So if you're asking like what a community does, right? There's so many different players in a community. So I guess when I hear community, I think of the grassroots efforts, the nonprofits, right? The local party clubs or League of Women Voters, that kind of thing, and what they're doing. And then there's all the external factors of what may or may not come into the community based on how competitive a race is or how hotly sought after a group's vote is, that kind of thing, yeah. So but the study was not at that community level. Yeah, I think you had your hand up before and then I'll.
Mindy, thank you for a great presentation.
Sure.
I wonder if you could explore some strategies on how to confront the apathy question. In Sacramento County, some labor unions and some congregations and health advocates got together, and we had a really major victory, I think, in getting health care for the undocumented. Limited, but it's victory. I can't help but feel that victories prompt people to want to register to vote and to vote because they can see something tangible affecting their lives. So I don't know what the story is like around the country, other mechanisms besides Victoria's campaigns to get people engaged.
Yeah, there's so much there. So I think I'll start broad, and then if I don't, prompt me to talk about individual campaigns. But So I think that the whole apathy question, like I mentioned before, and I really emphasize this because I'm out and about, right, sharing our research with folks and doing interviews sometimes and things, and I get that apathy question, or I get that apathy framing all the time. All right, I'll be talking to somebody that's heard about the numbers, and one of the first explanations before I've even said anything, they've asked me a question is, oh my gosh, why don't people care? The youth vote, you get it a lot, and it's pretty blatant when you're talking about the youth vote. Those darn kids, what are they doing? Why don't they care enough? Don't they understand? Don't they care about their community? I guess kids just want to play and have fun or whatever, right? And I really counter that narrative because first off, we know that there are a whole host of institutional barriers that are real barriers, right, that feed into attitudes and apathy, and are barriers in and of themselves and also feed into attitudes and apathy. But like I said, most of the time when you hear people talk, where it gets kind of categorized as apathy, people are really feeling disconnected. So it's a much bigger question. We could talk about reforms. We could talk about making voting more accessible, right? There's lots of research out there. Most reforms we would expect modest change, but modest change is change. And so there's work about how to implement certain reforms, how and why we should be doing this. But that other side, the how do we make people want to vote? You know, there's two buckets, making voting easier and then making people want to vote. The making people want to vote, I think, is so much harder. And I've spent most of my career trying to take people away from the apathy explanation, you know, and talk about the institutional barriers. But I'm starting to realize more and more that when you do that, there's always so many people in the audience that they may not nod and understand the institutional side of things, but still in their gut, they feel disconnected from the political process. See, look, heads are nodding, right? And so how do we affect that? We know there's a bigger issue here in our society. We have a low turnout culture, and we really need to figure out how to become a high turnout culture, right? So we have a low turnout culture because of institutional barriers in part, and then we also have people that look at their political system, young people particularly, because they've raised in an environment that's all that's been about is political bickering and shutting down the government and all those sorts of things, right? And so people don't feel connected. They don't think that their vote matters, right? There's some people that buy into civic duty, but if you talk to them, and if they really talk to them, they're doing it for their civic duty, but many of those folks that are voting for that don't necessarily see a connection or that their vote is really going to matter on the ground, right? And then aside from the civic duty folks, everybody else, it's a battle to get yourself out to vote or to be mobilized. So you can do things like have more competitive elections where people feel like if I vote, I actually could make a change, right? You can do things like have better outreach and education and mobilization and begin in the schools and get kids to buy into, right, the civic process and understand why it relates to them, why it matters. This is why it matters for your community. You care about all these issues in your community if you're a young person, but you don't see why casting a vote matters. Well, here, let's walk you through why it matters. You can do all of that, and that's something we need to do. But I think there's this larger issue with how our electoral system is structured, right? There's money in campaigns and politics that nobody's dumb about. Everybody understands that. And people don't trust the system, right? They could say, okay, it's a more competitive election. I now know if I got home and I'm really tired and I have to go out and vote, why vote? Well, I might actually make a difference in that race. But there'll still be those people that say, does it really matter, right? What's that politician or that party going to do? And there's lots of great politicians and people in this, elected officials in this room that really, really care. And then we've heard of a lot of bad things. But I think there's a narrative out there from what we see in our media, certainly, right, that is dominating and becoming a really big factor more and more. And the survey data support this, that people are becoming more and more disillusioned and feeling disconnected. I don't know if I have, to get back to you, I don't know if I have an answer to that. There are structural changes. I think schools, working in schools and getting to kids when they're young is absolutely huge. Absolutely huge. And then again, you begin to have that representative electorate from the outset, and they keep voting, and they, but how do we change that cultural issue, right? You compare us to the rest of the world, we're way below the rest of the world when it comes to turnout and how we view the importance of the electoral process. So anyway, yeah. Now that I've depressed you all.
Forgive me if this isn't the brief, I haven't read through it yet, but do you guys have, did you take into account how the new automatic voter registration law might impact all of that?
No. So this is a descriptive analysis. What happened in 2016, 2014, that's pretty straightforward. And then in what we're really doing in 2016 and beyond is isolating the impacts of population change, because there could be so many things, right? A wild and crazy governor's race in 2018, right? A scandal in the 2016 presidential, whatever, all kinds of things that could impact turnout in given communities across the state. So what we're saying is if we hold constant this, what would be the impact of population change, to give us some numbers for discussion around that. And then the question is, how do things increase or decrease? So we project it out at a county level. You can look at your county and say, this is what the population changes are, this is what the projections of the vote are. We've got kind of a touchstone. Now let's see what we can do about those turnout numbers. One more thing, and then automatic voter registration. Well, I guess I can answer your question there. But certainly many people, the research does tell us that we would expect it to be a positive effect on turnout. It has to be deeply coupled with, of course, outreach and education, but we would expect it to be a positive. But how much, it depends exactly its final form and how the outreach and how it rolls out across the state. So that would, again, at this point, premature, and our study was back in July, so yeah.
Did you take a look at any impact that online voter registration might have?
No, we have looked at online voter registration, and we will be doing a major study coming up next year. We did an early first look. It was implemented in September of 2012, and so for that election we looked at the early impact, and now we're revisiting it again and looking at how much it's grown, its use, and who's using it, and how it may be affecting some of the differences across the electorate, but not for this study, no. Yeah, I'm sorry. You had your hand up earlier too, forgive me. You've got this lovely tower right in front of you, so.
My question is this, what was the source of your research? Where do you get all the data?
Oh, good, yeah, so the data is actual voter records, so county records, and these are data that we acquired from the, sorry I'm tired at the end of the day, statewide database at UC Berkeley. So we take those data and then analyze them, and then couple it with population data. Voter registration, voter files, actual voter records. And then so looking at Latinos and Asian Americans, of course, that's not identified in the data. So the data is then taken and surname scanned to identify Latinos and Asian Americans. Yeah, of course.
Did you do any research regarding education versus voting?
In terms of likelihood of education impacting voter turnout?
The individual's education.
Yes. So in this study, this was descriptive at a state level. Like I said, we didn't look at individual. We didn't. The major way to do that is to do a regression analysis. We have done other work, and we actually have a study coming up in January that will look at typical factors like education and income, kind of tracing what that looks like in terms of just at a group level, and then we will also have to do some regression analysis looking at some predictors around that too. Yeah. But generally speaking, there's certainly lots of data that tell us what to expect when it comes to where you fall within the education spectrum and your likelihood of voting. Anybody else? I'll just stay. Let me just check time. I think we've got the room for a little while, so I'll just stay and keep answering questions, but certainly it's 3, so you can please leave. Thank you all very much for coming. Yeah. Oh.